Hello and welcome to the FPL Stats Fix with me, Tom Campbell. Let's get right into it. Hi everyone and welcome to the FPL Stats Fix. Now, first things first, I just want to reflect back on last week's show, which unfortunately we did have some technical difficulties there with the sound. I'm really hoping that I've managed to sort those out. Do please let me know in the comments below whether or not this is any better. If it's still sounding a little bit echoey, again, apologies. I have done my best to sort that, and hopefully now we are good to go and get right into some of the stats that we're here to take a look at. So I think first things first is to actually reflect that, we're still actually in an active game week. So it's made the format of this show a little bit different from what I would normally do. So with that in mind, we did want to get some content out there. We're trying to keep this regular to a Wednesday issuing of the video. So what I wanted to do today is to actually look at team by team which players have actually stood out in terms of how they've performed in terms of the points that they're actually picking up week on week versus how the fantasyfootballfix.com algorithm and metrics sort of would have predicted they would have done in terms of the expected points. And where I think that can become quite interesting is actually looking at, are players actually overperforming or in some case underperforming? Are there actually people who, actually the fix algorithm is suggesting, yeah, this is the sort of player that we were expecting to have returned a whole heap of points on any given game week, which would be kind of cool. And then actually, in reality, they are actually returning right similar numbers to those which have been predicted, which is, of course, exactly what you want as a fantasy football manager, to pick up players who are predicted and expected to score well and who actually are returning those points. And I'm going to go through them team by team, which is going to be really interesting, I think. And what we're going to do in terms of next week, because the scheduling is a little bit funky right now, next Wednesday will actually be in the middle of the next game week. It will have kicked off the day before. So it kind of doesn't lend itself to doing analysis on those fixtures that would have taken place by then. So I'm going to do the same format next week, but actually looking at a shorter game week range. So the last 6 game weeks is what I'll be looking at. So then we'll have a basis of comparison in terms of these are the players who, over the course of the season, this is how they've performed, and this is how Fantasy Football Fix would have expected them to have returned. And then we'll look at the things in terms of more recency, kind of coming into the equation there. So you'll get a view in terms of overall metrics and overall performance versus how they've actually done more recently, which is obviously something that we tend to focus on when we're looking to select players. So yeah, that's the focus of today's show. So let's get straight into it. So what I've done as well is I will go through team by team so you can show my method, or you can see the method that I've used, which is again using my favorite OptaStat sandbox, which is one of the tools that you can get when you use fantasyfootballfix.com. And effectively what you can do is pivot, as I mentioned last week, between players and teams respectively. Obviously we're looking at players this week, so the default is on players, so I've not needed to change the toggling there. And I'm looking at the full game week range as well, all positions, and then I've just gone by team. And what I've done is actually preemptively pulled those together into a table, which I'll share in a moment. And then those of you who are watching the video can take a look at that, and it should present for you some information there in terms of viewing them all as a collective across the whole league, which will be kind of interesting. So Arsenal, obviously, we're just going to go through alphabetical, and the 2 methods or metrics we're looking at here are the expected FPL points and the overall points. Now, the default would be to look at totals, but actually, I think it's more telling to look at per game information. I've kind of disregarded players who've just played less than a game, for example, and may have returned well in that particular game, but ultimately don't feature in the manager's thinking. Doesn't really lend itself to the analysis we're doing here. We're looking at players who are like regular starters or regularly getting minutes in their respective teams. So I've instead looked at per game as well. So the overall best performing player in the Arsenal team in terms of the average number of points that they pick up per game is Kieran Tierney at 5.1 million. And you can see there that actually equates really similarly, which isn't the case as we go through every team, to 4.87 in terms of his expected FPL points per game in the same period, which is the whole season, as we say. So in terms of like a standout performer there, Kieran Tierney is actually someone who you might want to think about bringing in. And particularly, I think, as well as we look into next season as well. We can repeat this analysis if people like it, and by all means get into the comments below, and do please smash a like on the video if you're enjoying this. We can repeat this at the end of the season to see how it compares to the kind of mid-season point. But Kieran Tierney is the standout there. And the table that I mentioned, and I will share this, or it's on screen already, so you can use this and take a look at it retrospectively, I guess. But actually, he's one of the players there who features, it has the same. He's the same name rather for overall most points per game on average, and expected. So there's quite a lot of backing there, I guess, reinforcement, I guess I should say, in terms of that's a player who's expected to have done well, the best indeed of all players. And I can just prove that by featuring on expected. You can see straight away Kieran Tierney, and as we say, it's filtered by default on the overall points. So Kieran Tierney is a player who stood out there from an Arsenal perspective. When we move on to look at Aston Villa, this was kind of the players. Obviously, there's the transfer window, and I'm recording this. I'm actually recording this on transfer deadline day, so there may be some other moves happening. We shall see. But Philip Coutinho's obviously come in and started well, but he's only played a handful of minutes so far. So whilst it might be encouraging, actually I think the goalkeeper Martinez is quite interesting there. Obviously, had an incredible season last season, but that similarity again between overall points and expected points is really close for Emi Martinez at 5.5 million, and it sort of again backs up the reinforces again what we saw last season as well. So again, as we sort of think about maybe goalkeepers again going into next season or post wildcard, it does lend itself to starting to think whether or not he is actually going to be someone. Obviously, Villa are spending a lot of money at the moment, and you'd expect them to strengthen. Callum Chambers being signed as well in the window has been defensive attribute, or defensive asset, I should say. You'd expect to improve things still further. So he's somebody that stood out there as well. When you actually filter though onto expected points, instead of total. Again, Dean is the kind of similar to, we talked about him a lot last week. But Luca Dean obviously played for Everton as well, so wasn't particularly relevant there. And I think we extolled the virtues of Luca Dean there last week as well. But Matty Cash as well on the opposite flank stands out there from an expected points return as well, at just under the 4-point mark for a defender, around about 5 million, 5.1 at the time of recording as well. Somebody who's underperformed slightly in reality, but in terms of those expected points, it might be something that FPL managers would look at when they tend to look at the start to look at the Aston Villa assets, of which there are many, I should say. The likes of Jacob Ramsey in midfield being a cheap enabler. There's going to be lots of different options, but certainly from an expected points return, Matty Cash really stood out there. So I found that quite interesting. And as mentioned, Emi Martinez was someone else who was interesting as well, possibly more of a long-term selection. When we look into the Brighton team, look, strikers have been a bit of a barren wasteland, haven't they, this season in FPL? But Neil Maupay features here in terms of the expected points for Brighton, just again under that 4 points. And if you could guarantee 4 points a game from a forward around the 6.5 million, I think you'd be pretty happy with that. And indeed, he does top the charts there for Brighton, 3.71 expected as well. So he's slightly overperforming, but not markedly. When we change it though, this guy has picked up a lot of attention, obviously approaching double game week territory, and we know Brighton have one, and I think he will be getting a lot of attention. Cucurella at wing back there, or full back, I guess, depending on how Potter sets up the side. But 5.1 million and expected points return per game of 4.83 is actually the top for Brighton. And when we look at the table, You can see how that compares amongst the sort of cohort that we're interested in, and it's impressive. So Cucurella, yes, the points returns are a little bit lower, but not so much that it would put you off. Is another player who really did interest. Bournemouth we're not interested in, bless them, they got relegated, so Fix does maintain those stats, which is going to be interesting. If you're looking for longer term, and if they were to get promoted, that would be relevant, but not for now. So we move on and look at Brentford. So I should say Brentford have completed the signing of Christian Eriksen, which is magic news. I think all football fans will be chuffed to bits to see him back, and from an FPL perspective as well, he's going to be a player of much interest, I'm sure, bearing in mind how much of an FPL darling he was at times in the past. And Fantasy Football Fix does enable you to look at historic stats, so you can actually dive into Christian Eriksen stats if you want to. And I might do that at the end of the video. We can take a look at that if we've got time. But from a Brentford perspective, in terms of overall points, average points return, it's quite a low number, 3.78, and it also relates to the goalkeeper who is being sort of long-term injured, but he was impressing early on, and I do think if they stay in the league, which I don't think is a certainty, but I do think if they stay in the league, he might be someone that we would be interested in. So don't see that price altering markedly, the 4.5 million range. I think it would be harsh to start him at 5 next season, but he was impressing early on in the season. Kind of need to rule him out right now because he's unavailable, but Ivan Toney's obviously been on social media this week and having to put out the flames on a fire that he started himself by, dissing his own club. So that's not ideal. But in terms of the expected points, 3.67 is no great shakes, and I sort of think that reflects where Brentford are right now. Not particularly enthusiastic about their prospects. Yes, it's an underperformance on the expected FPL points of 4.05, and his price is still affordable at 6.6, but it's not super exciting there. I think actually what's more interesting from a Brentford perspective is when we filter on the expected points. Janssen here is a defender that I've talked about many times, and it's because he's always leaps out in the stats in terms of sort of predicted points and expected points, and it's remaining true over the course of the whole season. So he plays centre half for Brentford, and expected FPL returns here are 4.36. It's the sort of thing where, from a predictive element, it's looking exciting. 2.87 though is not something you'd get massively enthusiastic about. But again, if you're looking for somebody to break out who's backed up by kind of predictive elements at 4.6 million, a very affordable price, that would be someone where the stats do back up that assertion, if indeed the reality has been somewhat different so far. Moving on to look at Burnley, who have been active in the transfer market today, and we know also have just a glut of games left to come, right? We know that there's going to be an awful lot of attention from FPL team selection perspective as and when those fixtures do get rescheduled and drop into the calendar. So it's worth taking a look at their output so far. Now, overall points, this I found really interesting actually. So we've been looking around the 3-4 mark, but it gets quite exciting when you see this number leap up to 5 here. And Cornet, who some of you it might be a bit of an afterthought now as he's been at the AFCON, but is available for the next game week. 5.9 million operating in the midfield is really interesting. As I say, they have a ton of games upcoming, and an average points per game return of 5 at 5.9 million, or even a higher price, way higher than that, you'd be super happy with that, is excellent. Yes, it's a significant overperformance on the expected FPL returns, but that might be indicative of the fact that he's a good finisher. So you'd need to make a decision there. But in terms of the actual average points per game for Maxwell Cornet within the Burnley side, he's streets ahead of his teammates. And, we've looked at a few teams now. Actually, that does really stand out quite favourably. So he's somebody definitely to think about in terms of their upcoming fixtures. If you're interested more in terms of, well, how are teams or players within Burnley, how have they been expected to have returned? It presents a slightly more familiar story in that it's more defensive sort of positivity, I guess. Tarkowski favours is the winner, I guess, there. But when you look at the price of 4.9 million compared to Matty Loughton at 4.4 million, that zero point 0.5 could be significant, and it's not a marked difference between the two. So in terms of the predicted or expected FPL returns between those two, yes, Tarkowski does shade it, but in terms of what you're actually getting there, it's not that big of a difference versus the 0.5 saving. So those would be two players to bear in mind as well, in terms of targeting Burnley's massive upcoming fixtures. Chelsea is where this got really kind of eye-opening, and you can see straight away, I'm sure your eyes have immediately drawn to that number 9, and that's because if I make sure that that's filtered on points rather than expected, it just shows how Chelsea are really struggling and suffering as a consequence of injury. So Ben Chilwell and Reece James, respectively, being out injured has really harmed their attacking prospects. And Ben Chilwell having a points return, average points per game in the games that he played, in the 540 minutes he was able to complete before he got injured, was averaging 9 points per game, which is extraordinary. Like, not sustainable, you wouldn't have thought, but even if it dropped down to the expected points, you're only talking about coming down to significantly over 6, which, based on the teams that we've gone through so far, should give a really good indication actually that just how good of an option Ben Chilwell is. And again, maybe one to think about more for next season, bearing in mind his convalescence period. Reece James, we're expecting back more soon, happily for him. Those stats are more closely aligned. 5.5 expected FPL points versus 5.69. But again, a great asset and something to really consider when you're looking at their Chelsea's upcoming fixtures, which right now you wouldn't be because of their World Club Cup commitments and what have you. In terms of the fixtures, they do not feature favourably, but ultimately they will do. So again, something to think about more in the long term. If we change to expected FPL points, no surprise Chilwell stays at the top there and Reece James just behind. But I did find it interesting that these are players that are in the selection pool. Marcos Alonso, always doubts over how favourably the manager actually sort of thinks of him, but the expected FPL returns there is great at over 5 points a game, or just over 5 points a game. And Rudiger as well, who's now up to 6.2 million, but is still expected to have returned 4.5 points per game on average. So again, really good options there defensively, in the same way that Burnley we talked about a few moments ago. Those are players that you might want to think about as well from a Chelsea perspective. Let's move on and take a look at Crystal Palace. More straightforward for Palace, in that it was a straightforward identification here, and no great surprises here in terms of how well Conor Gallagher has established himself in that midfield. Now up to 6.1 million. Suspect Chelsea might be interested in recalling him next season, so we shall see on that. But 5.3 points per game for Conor Gallagher versus an expected of just over 5. Really similar there. He's the definitive standout there. I wouldn't recommend any of the others based on what we've seen so far. If we change it to look at expected, there are some players there. Butland came in, had a man of the match display, and was immediately dropped. So need to see whether or not Vieira changes his stance on Jack Butland at 4.4 million. And Gay as well has done well from a defensive perspective, and is priced reasonably as well. So there are possibly some options there. But in terms of the standout, Conor Gallagher is it's the one to look at, and you've got confidence there in terms of it's not been a huge overperformance in terms of the points that he's picked up versus those that he was expected to pick up per the Fantasy Football Fix algorithm and metrics that feed into the expected points return methodology. Gosh, this is kind of grim. So Everton, obviously big changes there. They've appointed Frank Lampard now. Donny van der Beek is confirmed loan, and I suspect there's talk of Dele Alli. Again, I'm recording transfer deadline day, so we'll see. There'll be big changes afoot there. Obviously, a new manager coming in, you'd expect some kind of change in personnel, shape, attitude, etc. So kind of hard to know exactly how that will shake out. But for consistency, let's make sure that we do look at that. We can disregard Branthwaite's cameo appearance there. But if you look at the impact that Dominic Calvert-Lewin has had over the course of the season, and I know he will have stung managers recently, but he's still top of the Everton charts there, over that four points per game threshold. It is an underperformance, as we know. Missing a penalty wouldn't have helped that. But the expected points of 5.83 is actually really impressive. So there's hope for DCL. As I mentioned before, forwards have been a nightmare to choose from, and I'm sure people watching will have shared in that frustration. But there's encouragement there at 7.9 million. There is a new manager in town. There's new creative players being signed, and there's a possibility that he might become a viable selection based on the stats as well. In terms of expected, was there anything else there? I don't think there was. Actually, I wouldn't suggest dwelling too much on there. As I say, there's big changes afoot at Everton. So let's move on and take a look at Leeds instead. So from a Leeds perspective, this was really, from a statistical perspective, it was great to see such consistency here between these two figures for Rafinha. So he tops the tree in terms of points returned, average points per game, 4.84. And look how close that is. That's statisticians, or if you wanted to back up the model effectiveness, then this would be a player that you'd say this is encouraging. Expected FPL points 4.88. So Rafinha has been really consistent in a poorly performing Leeds team, both in terms of how games have played out, in terms of how you'd expect him to have performed versus the reality. So that has remained true all season, and 6.6 million, again, very affordable price, and suggest he should still remain in people's thoughts. In terms of expected, I did find this quite interesting as well. Bamford's been injured for ages now, this mystery injury or multiple injuries he sustained over the course of the season has really harmed Leeds. But if he were to become fit and you get some confidence in terms of him being available ongoing, then suddenly you've actually got a player on your hands who might be interesting you again. Expected was lower than his output, but it's around that 4 mark as well. So it would be a huge differential. Leeds have been poor this season. But if you wanted to take a flyer, there is some semblance of suggestion that Bamford might become viable later on in the season, pending that fixed sort of fitness becoming available again. From a Leicester perspective here, let's look at points again. First, overall points. The evergreen Jamie Vardy, 4.94, just under 5 points per game on average. So I guess with his age now, versus that price of being over 10 million, sort of in that premium bracket, it becomes more difficult to have the confidence in terms of will he always be selected and available as he manages his game time with his manager a little bit more cautiously. When he does play, though, he's averaging around 5 points per game, which is awesome. Maybe not awesome, but super happy with that. Expected is lower, but not markedly so again. So encouraging there as well. Did find it interesting though when we changed the filter on expected FPL points instead. 4.48 is actually Yuri Tielemans there as well. So he's a player that is again really affordable and mightn't be the most sort of sexy pick, but in terms of expected points, Fix is suggesting that actually he is the one who is going to be most reliable from a Leicester perspective over the course of the season thus far. Just going to take a look here to see if there were any notes. I think I've mentioned them all. Just bear with me one moment. I've mentioned the Rudiger one as well. Rafinha, I believe, was Bamford. Yeah, that's right. And now we're moving on to Liverpool. So that's absolutely fine. Liverpool, obviously, those of us who are taking FPL seriously will know about the duo of Mo Salah and Trent Alexander-Arnold, respectively. So don't want to sort of focus too much on them, or just a reflection, really, I guess, in terms of how much higher those average points per game return versus expected compared to pretty much everyone, Chilwell aside. So it should give you confidence that it does make sense to get Mo Salah back in if you haven't already done so. If you kept him through the AFCON, don't need to worry about that, of course. But he is someone who's going to come back into the thinking very, very quickly once he's made available following the conclusion of that tournament. And similarly, Alexander-Arnold as well, returning just awesome numbers. Again, where I thought was quite interesting was the third best expected FPL points per game. It's shading Robertson over Jota at the moment. Obviously, Liverpool have strengthened in the attacking section now over the January transfer window as well. Robertson is shading that. It's close. Of course, you can see between 5.78 and 5.65, there's nothing significantly or statistically significant, I should say, really in that. But if you were looking for evidence, and there's obviously a cost saving as well, then Robertson is slightly edging Jota in terms of expected FPL points per game. And obviously, you've got a not insignificant price difference there of 7.1 million versus 8.4 million, and added competition for Jota ongoing. So that was the main observation from a Liverpool perspective. Man City, this was quite an interesting one as well, in that what leapt out to me here, I mean, we can kind of forget Stefan here as well. It was a cameo in goal. Torres, as we know, has moved on. Cancelo, I suspect, is fairly ubiquitous in FPL for FPL managers already. And again, it's justifying that in terms of, 6 points per game on average versus an expected return of 6.4, give or take. Super consistent there. There's no reason to suspect that those numbers are going to drop off. But if we change to expected FPL points, where sort of leaping out for me again, forget Torres, is Laporte and Diaz respectively. So there is a cost saving for between the two centre halves of 5.7 million versus 6.3. To me, this is just advocating for the triple up at defensively. If you can make room, if you're on wildcard, or if you have free transfers and you're looking to, reshuffle money, the algorithm from a fixed perspective is advocating for, from a Man City perspective, if you wanted 3 Man City players in, and it'd be hard to argue against that, they're such a good team, it's the defensive players who are really standing out in terms of expected FPL points. When they play, they're expecting to return well. Man United is a bit more straightforward. I say that Ronaldo is the standout in terms of expected points, 4.78. Slight underperformance in terms of expected FPL there as well, but around that 5 points per game mark, which I've mentioned before, is perfectly acceptable there. I think I used the word awesome, maybe not that high, but is perfectly acceptable. And versus the expected FPL points, Bruno Fernandes is someone who's in a lot of people's teams right now as they've reacted to, while Salah was at AFCON, etc. And he'll remain in the thinking for the upcoming double game week. And that's backed up here in terms of how Fix suggests his expected points per game. I think this is quite interesting. Pogba, less so. He is back in training now, but there's question marks over his contract situation. Well, his contract situation is that it expires in the summer, so there's question marks as to the commitment to the club. How much will the club want to play him in that period if he's not committed to the cause? Would he want to risk injury, etc.? Great player when he's available, of course, and this is suggesting, over the course of the season, in the 600 and change minutes he's played, still a good return. I like this one, Rafael Varane. Again, not the most sort of attractive pick from an attacking perspective, but 4 points per game expected for 5.5 million in terms of having an upcoming double game week. Somebody to think about, definitely. Now, Newcastle, in much the same way that we'd mentioned Everton, so much changing there as well. They don't have the new manager right now in terms of Eddie Howe's been in place for a while, but they are signing players. There's still hours to go in this deadline from when I'm recording, so this could even change. So, a pinch of salt here, but normally I would disregard this because Trippier's only played 180 minutes, but at 5 million and the spending that they're making, I think you could do worse than look at Trippier. 4.5 average points over the 2 games. Expected to have returned a little bit lower. I think because we know about him a little bit more, he might be someone of interest from a Newcastle perspective. Again, they're going to need to react to the changes in the players that they're bringing in and they have brought in already. So might be more of a watching brief from Newcastle perspective. If you wanted to look at the information that's happened so far and players that you think will keep the place in the team, Saint Maximin you'd expect will be one of those. And again, around that 4 points per game would be possibly someone to think out, although I'd be hard pushed to advocate for that with so many other options, I think. Wilson, again, we mentioned forwards a few times as well. Injury notwithstanding, it's always going to be someone of relative interest, I suspect, and there may be more opportunities if the personnel around him improves. But from a Newcastle perspective, there weren't many standouts, if I'm honest, so far. that I'm sure will change over the course of the rest of the season and in seasons to come. Norwich. Now, Norwich obviously started the season just abhorrently. They weren't in anyone's thoughts, completely reasonably so. So, take this for what it's worth. Gunn, not going to waste any time thinking about him, but from a Pookie perspective, these aren't great numbers either. They're the best that Norwich were offering. So I think just to make this somewhat relevant, and it's a bit of a spoiler for next week, because I actually say I want to look at a more focused range next week. But if we just take this down to game weeks 19 through, well, it says 38, but it's effectively for the how many games have taken place since then. And just make sure I'm looking at. Now let's take it a little bit. Let's do it 18 actually. Take that just a little bit further. 450. Yeah, I'd say that's a reasonable period there. If we look at expected FPL points instead, this name leaps out. So Sargent obviously scored. He got a big haul in the last game week, didn't he? I'm not necessarily advocating that everyone should go out and sign Sargent in their FPL teams, but if you're looking to free up funds, 5.4 million again up front has been a difficult situation for managers to think about, and there is competition in terms of the likes of Brozier, for example, but it would be out there. And whilst it's only been a sort of handful of minutes so far, they have been playing a lot better under Dean Smith, backed up by stats and evidential evidence on the pitch. So expected points of 3.37, that's fine. The average points though of 5, as I've said it a few times, is great. So maybe one to just keep an eye on, I would say. That was all I would mention from a Norwich perspective. Let's just take that back to the full range now and move on and look at a perfect segue there. As I mentioned, Brozier, didn't I? Look at Southampton now. So points-wise, J Ward-Prowse, and again, little hint to next week, J Ward-Prowse over recent game weeks has been awesome. And he's still the Saints' top performer in terms of average points per game over the course of the season. 6.3 million, set piece specialist, as we know, really similar to the expected FPL returns, just a steady FPL asset, I guess, and one that often doesn't get sort of talked about enough, probably. If we look at the expected FPL points, I did just notice Brozier that. I'll take a look at him again in a moment. But expected FPL points, this is someone who is interesting to me. Jan Bednarak, 4.4 million, cheap as you like. And, back available now. And, just someone I think, again, doesn't really get talked about. I mean, the expected FPL returns of 4.5 for a Southampton defender is way higher than I would have intuitively thought. He's underperformed slightly against that, but it's not someone in the narrative right now. And I suggest that based on these stats over the course of the season, he kind of should be. I just want to take a look at the points overall again, just to mention. Obviously, we had a conversation there, didn't we, about Sargent? So Brozier, I think, will be in a lot of people's teams already. Certainly, if you're wild carding, it would be someone to look at as an enabler type figure as well. And expected wise is slightly lower than I would have expected, or would have reasonably kind of thought, having seen him play, because he does impress. But the FPL returns of 3.5 per game at 5.2 million is absolutely fine. So moving on to Tottenham. Spurs. Now, Son really does stand out here. 6.35. So, he has been unavailable for a while, and we did get the news from Antonio Conte that he wouldn't be available until after this international break. So we'll need to see on his fitness status. But we know about Heung-min Son's potential and his returns over a pretty long period now. So not surprising to see this great average of over 6, getting on for 6.5 points per game over the course of the season. Not hugely different from the expected 5.5 as well. So just a great asset. 10.6 million, you're paying a lot for him, but you know exactly what you're getting, and there's a lot of confidence there in terms of what he's likely to return. If we were to filter on expected as well, he tops that chart as well. Tottenham have been active in the transfer market again already over the last couple of days, and they may be in the next few hours as well. So we shall see. And I'll be really interested when we look next week as well at the shorter game week range, because they have found a little bit of form, particularly Harry Kane. And go on then, let's take a look. A little spoiler now. Let's do a shorter range, game week 20. let's see how much that extends to. So 4 game week maximum, and if we do expected FPL, okay, so Bergwijn's still there. That's really interesting as well. Of course, he didn't get Son didn't get injured until more recently, but Harry Kane there is, yeah, it's creeping up, isn't it? So there's excitement around Kane, and it's a bit of a spoiler for next week, but it's the sort of thing that we, form obviously changes over the course of time rather than looking over the course of the whole season, but that might be something that excites people in terms of where to spend their money up front. Moving on to look at Watford in terms of the overall points. Oh, I just need to change the game week range back. Look at the full season. Total points. Now, this is a name people won't want to be spending any time thinking about, as so many people, myself included, captained this guy for the current game week, which is still ongoing, the never-ending game week. Dennis. But yeah, we can say there was reason for this. There was science behind this. He was averaging 4.89 points per game over the course of the season, expected of over 4. So that gave you confidence, but probably shouldn't belabor that point, should I? Because people are furious with him. In terms of expected points, though, they've missed Sarr, haven't they? But when Sarr was available, and still really great price there as well. I remember looking at Match of the Day earlier on in the season, and him operating on that right hand or in the right hand channel was super exciting. And expected points of 4.5 for a 5.7 million asset, and these overall points of 4.4. Fabulous returns there, and someone who won't be on many people's thoughts right now. New manager, not a particularly exciting manager. He averages 1 win in 3 over the course of his Premier League tenure across multiple teams, does Roy Hodgson. If he does that, he'll keep them up, but it might not be the most exciting football. So we'll see. Sarr was the standout in terms of expected points. Let's move on to my team, West Ham. Points wise, so Jared Bowen has been in scintillating form. Price is skyrocketing now, is up to 6.9 million. There's been another recent price rise for him over the international break, averaging 5.4, just under 5.4 points over the season, almost 5 on the expected as well. Really is looking like a player who is going to rightly be in many people's thinking. The stats absolutely back that up. And he's a player who I'm sure people have a lot of confidence in keeping and playing in even tough fixtures. And I wouldn't advise against that at all. In terms of expected points, he leads that chart as well. Antonio, as we know, we kind of expect him to be there as well, and sort of really close similarity between expected and total, average points for Antonio. Cresswell's someone who I mentioned recently as well, come back from injury. Last season, he was the West Ham top point scorer, I believe, as well. Someone who we just kind of don't think about. I think there's still a reluctance to spend over 5 million on a West Ham defender. I get that, believe me. But in terms of his expected points, obviously, defenders aren't limited to just clean sheets. They can score attacking returns. And Aaron Cresswell, again, in the mix from a stats perspective. Finally, then, looking at Wolves from a total points perspective, Ait Nouri, apologies if I've mispronounced that, but Ait Nouri, 4.91, yes, minutes hasn't been plentiful. When he gets picked, though, at 4.3 million, I found that really interesting. Almost 5 points per game, expected of over 4. So there's a correlation there, some consistency there as well. Someone who has never entered my thinking, if I'm honest, but someone who probably should have done based on this statistical evidence. Jose Sarr, from a defensive perspective or goalkeeper perspective, similar to Martinez at the beginning of the video. Someone who we should probably be looking at there as well, possibly for next season as well. Be interesting to see what price he comes in at. And expected points, I found this quite interesting as well. That Semedo, again, a really happy price here at 4.8 million. Expected points of 4.47. You'd be disappointed if you owned him because his overall points coming in per game has been under 4. So could I recommend him? Probably not. I think it's one of those ones where Semedo is there's going to be other options around that 5 million which you're going to be more tempted to look at. But I did find that interesting. Guys, thanks so much for watching. I think in terms of the Christian Eriksen link, I think I'm going to keep that for next week because I don't actually believe he's actually yet been officially priced. That will come in due course, and I will do a little feature on him in next week's video as well, looking at how he performs statistically for Spurs on average over the last few seasons before he left. And it's awesome to see him back playing Premier League football again, or will be awesome to see him back playing football. Brentford are already a team that many of us like for the way that they've played, and I'm sure that will only continue because of Christian Eriksen being back in the team. Anyway, that about completes it for this week's Fantasy Football Fix Stats Fix. From me, Tom Campbell, you can find me on Twitter at UtterlyTC. Do come and give me a follow. Get your comments in below. I do hope the sound has been an awful lot better this week. Do subscribe to fantasyfootballfix.com. They've got a whole suite of tools which are fab if you're into the stats as I am. So go and give that a subscription. Smash a like on the video, subscribe, and I'll see you next week. Thanks very much.